Welcome back to Nothing But the Truth. I'm Trudy Stern, and this is a very important episode, maybe one of the most important episodes we've done. Right now, the world is in a deeply precarious moment. What many see as isolated conflicts in the Middle East, in Ukraine, in Asia, are in fact interconnected. A common thread runs through them, a coalition of bad actors, Iran, China, and Russia, working together to undermine the West. This isn't just a battle being waged abroad. America itself is a front in this multi-front war. The battlefield is our own college campuses, where pro-Hamas protests have morphed into explicitly anti-American movements. What we're seeing today is not only anti-Semitism, it's a coordinated campaign against the core values of Western democracy. So how do we make sense of all of this? How do we connect these dots? Joining me today is someone who understands this landscape better than almost anyone, Zineb Riboua. She is the Director of Research at the Middle East Forum and a fellow at the Hudson Institute, one of the most respected policy think tanks in Washington, known for shaping national security strategy and defending American interests around the globe. Zineb is an expert on transnational Islamism, Iranian influence, and the networks working to undermine the West from within. Her work is deeply respected by policymakers and national security leaders, and she's become one of the most important voices connecting the dots between foreign threats and their domestic consequences. Zineb, welcome to Nothing But the Truth.
Thank you very much, Trudy, for having me. It's a real honor.
We are so happy to hear from you. Maybe not so happy because what you're going to tell us is very frightening. So let's begin with what's happening in Africa and the Polisario Front, which is something that most of our listeners might not have ever heard about.
Yeah, well, what is happening in Africa, especially in West Africa and the Sahel in general, is pretty bleak. I mean, what basically happened was that the French were massively involved in stabilizing the region, in conducting counterterrorism operations, in fighting against the jihadists. But because of a campaign, a very coordinated campaign that the Russians have promoted and have pushed for, the French had to leave the Sahel. And with that, they had to leave the whole framework to stabilize the region. And of course, the Russians took advantage of that. There were several coups, coup d'etats in places like Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso. Now all of the leaders of these countries are aligned with the Russians, but more so, they're aligned with the Russians and are happy to collaborate and cooperate with the Iranians. Out of that, the Iranians got a deal, for example, a uranium deal with Niger. The Iranians also saw the opportunity and are starting, a diplomatic campaign because, in their essence, the Iran regime and the Islamic Republic is really a revolutionary regime, and so it always seeks to find new proxies, new partners to spread its so-called revolution. And so with that, there is also the fact that Morocco, which is a U.S. ally, collaborates with NATO and also with the EU members, also is part of this greater campaign to fight against terrorism, especially in West Africa and so on, has been subject to a campaign by a group that is called the Polisario Front. It does not necessarily use the same tactics as Hezbollah and others, but it is aligned ideologically and strategically with, for example, Iran, who sees the instability of Morocco as key to achieve its objectives. So, for example, when President Trump announced that he recognizes the sovereignty of Morocco over Western Sahara, one of the first things the Polisario Front did which is a group that is based in Algeria, was to declare war on Morocco because this group says that Western Sahara is theirs and Morocco is a colonial, imperial Zionist project, and that it should not rule over the Western Sahara. But what they were actually trying to do was to destabilize the region, because having access to the Atlantic Ocean would help them get more strategic clout, have access to strategic choke points, etc. And so, of course, Morocco has been fighting against that and has been very successful, but there's always the risk, because of how much the Iranians have been propping proxies, etc., that the Polisario will become much more aggressive. And there is a trend now. They already are. They've been firing rockets on Moroccan cities, etc., and making threats. This is something that I think is very dangerous. It's a very dangerous escalatory situation from the Polisario's end. For the United States, it means that, despite recognizing Morocco's sovereignty over the Western Sahara, there's much more to do to actually help Morocco counter the threat. I think Morocco is doing, however, a good job on its own and really is very sensitive to getting the United States involved. I think there's a clear vision for Morocco to handle its security on its own. And I think, but this is really a trend. And on top of that, because of what I mentioned earlier, the French vacuum and the security vacuum in the Sahel, there's also the jihadi threat. Al Qaeda, ISIS, JNIM, another organization, they've been really, really growing in the Sahel to the point where they have their own recruitment videos, they have their own recruitment playbook. It's a very dangerous situation right now in Africa.
So for our listeners who don't know what Sahel is, can you please explain that?
Well, it's really the geographic. It's really a buffer between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. It's really a desert. It goes from Sudan to Sudan, Chad, Niger, Mali, to Mauritania. It's really that Sahara desert zone.
And that is being overtaken by these terrorist groups.
Yeah, the Al Qaeda, especially other jihadist groups, have been very successful in taking over territories. On top of that, as you know, there is the civil war in Sudan, so the whole Sahel is basically in flames.
And these bad actors are very active there. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so that's one front that is taking place. And how the Polisario group, it sounds to me like they're being groomed to be the Houthis, where they are going to really interfere with trade in the water. Is that true?
Well, not yet, but the fact that they won the Western Sahara, which has direct access to the Atlantic Ocean, seems to be one of their objectives. They're very nefarious in the sense that they do not want a diplomatic solution. I think Morocco has suggested several times, to dismantle the group and the people who live there, they can come join and live in Morocco's Western Sahara peacefully, that there is maybe a political solution to this, but they've been really deaf to all of that, and they really, as like other groups that Iran supports, they want armed resistance and of course more violence against Moroccans.
So most people aren't really focused on that area, but how dangerous do you see this?
Well, I think it's very dangerous because the same happened in Yemen. The Houthis were very marginalized. They were not a very serious threat, and then all of a sudden they get now ballistic missiles from Iran. They use the aid that they receive. You know, Europeans and other organizations, they send aid to Yemen, thinking that the aid is going to go to the populations that are suffering from famine and other things. But no, they go to the Houthis, who sell the aid they receive so that they can finance themselves. It's very dangerous, given what I already, explained about the context, how the region where the Polisario operates is already a very dangerous region, where jihadists are really growing in numbers, and also in their ambition. And so I think this is where the threat is.
And is China and Russia also active in that area?
Actually, the Russians and the Chinese are very clever. They're not active in the sense of openly supporting and openly, making statements, etc. What they do is that they know that Morocco, which is a U.S. ally, is stuck in the UN with the Western Sahara question, and they use the fact that they can vote and veto a lot of the resolutions to put pressure on Morocco, so that Morocco cannot really take strong positions really against Russia or against China. So it's really for them a strategic, really a chess game. And I think this is something that the Moroccans have tried to encounter by being closer to Europe, by being closer to the United States, by having more US investments, by having especially more defense cooperation and more military cooperation with Israel. And I think this really helps Morocco diversify and really prevent any risk or danger coming from China and Russia.
So moving right along to the next front, um, is Ukraine and Russia.
Mm.
So can you fill us in on what is happening in Ukraine and Russia right now?
Well, I think the big story today is really how Trump is openly stating that he wants to support Ukraine with weapons. I think this is a big development, a development that many would have failed to predict a few months ago, like just a few weeks ago, given all the all the political games and discourse and etc. But I think that what is happening is really interesting. The Trump administration has done an incredible job in making the case for Ukraine without saying it. They with the critical minerals deal, they actively tied U.S. Economy to to Ukrainian economy. They also have helped Ukraine make the case that it can rely on Europe by pushing Europeans to spend more and to change their posture from defensive to offensive. And lastly, and I think this is very important, the United States has also entered discussions with Turkey, who plays a big role in the Black Sea, especially in countering Russian dominance. And the fact that Ukrainians now talk with Turkey when it comes to their security, because Turkey is one of the only countries now that still pushes for Ukraine to join NATO. And it's very important because the Turks are against Russia in Syria, they're against Russia in Libya, and so it helps Ukraine diplomatically on many ways. And so I think that for all these reasons, the Trump administration has recalibrated US posture, so that Trump can make a statement of that sort. There's also the fact that, with as you've seen with the big beautiful bill and all the other strategies and operations, US military is now being more dynamic. They're reproducing more. They're looking to produce more, because one of the issues was, oh, we're going to send weapons to Ukraine, but we don't have enough. Well, you can make more, and I think now the Trump administration is enabling and helping the United States to develop more of its military industrial complex, so that it can help Ukraine defeat Russia for a very simple reason. Um, Putin was offered in so many instances and so many ways an opportunity to make a deal with the United States on Ukraine to get a ceasefire and so on. He repeatedly said no. And I think that the fact that that Trump said, we have a 50 days deadline, a little bit like what happened in Iran. We have a 60 days deadline, and then he also, there was this leak saying to Ukrainians, oh, what can you do to hit Moscow, a little bit like how the Israelis hit Tehran on day 61. It's already, a shift in how the Trump administration is seeing how a win for Russia is also a win for China and a win for Iran.
So before we bring our conversation um, back to the Middle East, which will be our next front that we're going to look at, um, let's just connect some dots here. So we have do we it seems like we have the same bad actors in the African front and the Ukraine Russia front. So we have Russia directly involved here, and we have Iran supplying drones, and you have China backing Moscow economically. So can you speak a little bit about these bad actors coalescing here in this front, very similarly to what you had explained in Africa?
Yeah, so I think that there are many in Washington who say that, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians do not have a sort of alliance. And they're not an alliance in a Western sense, which is true. They're not an alliance. They don't have their own NATO. They don't have their own framework. However, they are aligned on one objective, and it's to weaken the United States and to weaken U.S. allies. And this is why whenever, for example, the Russians go after the Ukrainians, the Iranians were more than happy to help the Russians. This is why the Russians have been able to make such a great to make such a great advancements in their military operations in Ukraine is because the Iranians were helping the Russians build their drone factories. They trained Russians on how to use drones, on how to build drones. The Russians have been able, thanks to the Iranians, build their own factories in Tatarstan and elsewhere. And so there is a relationship there that they exploit whenever there's a Western weakness, and they get together to make it worse. There's also the fact that, for example, the Chinese and the Iranians collaborate massively to the point where there's a Chinese company that was caught sending, geographical targets through I think a very sophisticated company, and it sends it to the Houthis so that they can target Western ships. There's also the fact that China has been buying Iranian oil massively, and it helped Iran finance its proxies. It's true that the Russians and the Chinese have not helped Khamenei while he was under siege, and it sent a very bad, I think, very bad signal to the global new order that they want to build, that they can do without the United States. I think it sent a bad signal. However, they're very patient. They know that Iran is going nowhere, that the revolutionary regime is still there, and that the Chinese can maybe help in the future. One of the things that happened was that the Chinese were, for example, helping the Iranians and consulting them, and also exchanging with them on how to get a better position on their negotiations with the United States. And I think that this is where the people should focus on how they really do align on one objective, despite the fact They don't necessarily coordinate or have, synchronized actions, but they do benefit from each other.
So the next front that I want to look at in this multi-front attack on the West is the Middle East, Syria, Iran, Hamas, Israel. So that is something that we've explored very extensively on this podcast. But now new events have taken place very recently. So can you speak about what's going on in the Middle East right now with regard to these players?
Well, I think that a lot, of course, is going on. It would be unfair to try to give a quick summary, but if I had to do so, I would say that at least from a US perspective, there is a gigantic opportunity here to explore. Despite what happened between, the Druze, as well as with other Bedouins or the Syrian army, who are al-Shara's people. I mean, the president of Syria. I think that from a U.S. perspective, the weakening of Iran is something that needs to also be exploited politically, in a sense that stabilizing Syria is in the interest of everyone, especially of Israel. Making sure that Syria does not become another failed state where the Iranians can do their operations again, where Hezbollah can come back. I think these are things the Israelis are, of course, very concerned about, and they're also concerned about the state of minorities, which should be protected. But I think here the United States has a better, I think, position when it comes to making the case for it, but also making sure that the current president of Syria makes concessions. He desperately wants less sanctions. He wants to connect the Syrian economy to the Western world, etc. But in order for him to do that, he needs to make sure that all minorities are respected. And I think this is something the United States can do. The other thing that I think is very important is that, in regards to Hamas, of course, there is I do not see any solution to this, quite frankly, unless Hamas is absolutely defeated. And I think that this is the same for Israelis and the same for the United States. But one thing I saw that I thought was very interesting was how much the United States is much more involved now in the humanitarian side of it. Why? Because aid was really a political tool for Hamas. They used aid to appeal to the population, to say that they're not going to get aid unless Hamas runs it. But now that it was taken away from them, they're absolutely going crazy. And I think this is something that the United States did very cleverly. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, etc. I think these are, I think, good developments, but also making sure that, as I said, Iran does not start again their destabilization playbook is going to be very important, because I don't see this ending yet.
So, and can you just say what the involvement of China and Russia are into this region?
I would say that for the Russians, they are still looking into how they can maintain a good relationship with the Syrian President al-Shara. Why? Because under Assad, the Russians had military bases. They were able to turn Syria into a logistics hub because they're operating in Libya and elsewhere, and Central Africa Republic and in Africa. Syria was very important for them, but it was also important for another reason. Um, Having access to the Eastern Mediterranean has always been a dream for the Russians, especially for Putin. And he was able to do that thanks to Assad. And it was very important because being in the Eastern Mediterranean helps you put more pressure on NATO. People focus a lot on NATO Eastern Front, but there's also the Southern Front. all the debacles and all the catastrophic videos that we saw from of refugees and Syrians, and a lot of other people leaving and going to Europe. These were things that the Russians were actively involved in blackmailing Europe with migration. And I think depriving them from that is going to be very important. The Russians are still operating in Libya, and that's still very problematic. Um, of course, there are other sides to this where the Russians want to maintain good ties with all of the Middle East countries because they know that they're very important when it comes to sanctions, to financial sanctions, but also in terms of oil, etc. The Chinese have a little bit of a different vision to this because they are building the Belt and Road Initiative. Iran is key for that. So they try to maintain a good relationship with all of these countries. But also the Chinese, because they are aware that they want to invade or blockade at some point Taiwan, etc., that they have greater ambitions, they want to make sure that they're close enough to US allies to the point where if China does something, the United States cannot enforce sanctions. That the one of the biggest successes for China was to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Beijing, so that they made sure that Saudi Arabia is close enough to the Chinese, and that the Iranians do not that they basically neutralize Saudis because. For example, this was very interesting. I said that to a friend that the during the GCPOA when there was this talk about a nuclear deal with Iran, there were two main vocal actors, and it was Israel and Saudi Arabia. But because the Chinese played a big role in making sure the Saudis become friends again with the Iranians, they're no longer vocal. They completely neutralized them. And that's a big win for China in terms of reshifting and really making sure that the Middle East order is not an American order.
Very, very fascinating. So we were always thinking about Israel as fighting a seven front war, or very, a lot of people are always talking about this seven front war, but actually it's a multi front war against the West. Yes, Israel is fighting a seven front war, that is true, but that's part of a much more global war against the West. So moving right along to the next front that seems to be part of this global war, and that is America and what is happening in America with regard to anti Semitism, and that being a strategic threat, not just a social one. So, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, when we spoke about this before, I thought that I definitely see anti-Semitism as more than a simple social or cultural problem. It's really a national security problem because it's weaponized that way. The fact that it's really not a coincidence that anti-Semitism is weaponized not just against American Jews but also against anyone really who talks about the importance of Israel in fighting and countering terrorism and fighting against Iranian proxies, etc. Which actually benefits the United States, so that the United States doesn't have to send troops, and anyone who makes the case for a better United States where there's this proliferation of a third worldist ideology that says that the United States is an imperial evil country, and because it is the case, we should concede and give everything away to America's enemies, and that Iran, despite the fact that they killed hundreds and hundreds of Americans, we should not be as harsh on them, that they had their own they had their own assessments, and that this is I think it's a very intelligent way of making sure that the United States does not protect its interests and does not go after what is good for the United States. It's absolutely horrendous. I mean, what I've been seeing is, um, especially because it's done in a very clever way to push for a domestic and political agenda without naming it, and it makes people, in these blurry lines about, oh, they're talking about Israel and they're talking about anti-Israel, but no, they're actually really talking about America, and they're doing so because when Israel defends itself against terrorists, so that America cannot do so. When they say, for example, that Israel should not fight Hamas and should not do all of these things. Well, they're saying these things because they don't want the United States at some point to fight against all the terror groups and cells that threaten it. So I think the way that this anti-Semitism problem is evolving, I think it's evolving for really domestic reasons, and it's been very clear.
So let's just examine a couple of facts with regard to the anti-Semitism that's going on in the United States. First of all, it was unleashed on October 8th.
Yeah,
So it seems to me no coincidence that war breaks out in Israel on October 7th, Hamas attacks, and all of a sudden, our college campuses are set up with encampments, with coordinated tents, with coordinated outfits, and people just emerging, almost like the fence breaking in Israel on October 7th, and it unleashed a firestorm of anti-Semitism across our country that always ends up in anti-American also. Yes, it starts out with all of the complaints about Israel being a genocidal, apartheidal country entity, and then always ends up with burning of American flags and anti-American
yeah.
sentiments also, very much linked. So can you speak about that? It seems to me very coordinated.
Yeah, it's definitely coordinated in a sense that the anti-Semitism is really an anti-Americanism, because it goes against what this country was founded upon, and I think this is I think, of course, it's really one group, because the way they approach Israel as this oppressor versus the oppressed, and of course the apartheid state, etc. That's also their vision of America, and that the only way for the United States to purify itself is to go against Israel. And it's very, as I say, it's very clever. But they've been doing that, through universities, all the colonial type of ideologies have been spreading really in a lot of, people who study Middle Eastern, people are in Middle East studies, I think, can tell you a lot of that, how there's this Marxist view of things, that there's always an oppressor and oppressed, and the capitalist state is the enemy, and all of these ideological tendencies. And of course, I think ideologically it's coordinated, and that the Iranians are also very clever, and they see that, and they push it even further. They do spread there's a lot of disinformation campaigns. It's also demoralization campaigns against Americans, saying how much their country, is not, is run by people who hate them, and all of these things. Well, because they understand that there is actually a debate. There is a debate about the elite in America, etc. But they seized that opportunity to demoralize people and to demoralize Americans and turn them against their own country. And of course, I definitely think it's more and more coordinated.
So this is weakening our internal cohesion. That's basically what it's doing, and damaging our credibility abroad, um, because we're unable to just we're so divisive within our own country. Do you see this as another deliberate front in the global war that we've just been discussing? Are we treating this with the seriousness that it deserves?
I don't think so, and I don't think so yet for a very simple reason. For example, when President Trump decided to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities, which is the right thing to do, and he did it in such a masterful and elegant way, so that there are no troops in the ground, etc. It was done in a very good way. Well, there were so many people saying, especially on his own camp, who were buying into the Iranian propaganda and saying that, oh no, we're going to go for another war, and that Israel dragged us into a war against Iran, and that everything's going to explode. But of course, none of that happened. But it was done so that there's a fracture in how the United States should conduct its foreign policy and go after its interests. Um, and so yeah, I think of course the goal is against internal cohesion. And I think the President Trump is already showing how it can be handled, and the way it can be handled is to simply ignore them. And I think he's been doing that, against a lot of people, he supported and who supported him. But I think it's really a good way of handling it.
So when we look at everything that's happening in Africa, Ukraine, the Middle East, and now here in the US, it seems to be often the same players fueling the instability. So in the United States, um, if you could just speak about the college campuses and the Confucius institutes, and so that's China. Definitely see Iran, hand here. Um, are they the same players here in the United
Yes.
States? Here in the United States.
Yeah, for example, I myself I was part of a Confucius Institute, and because I wanted to learn Chinese because I work a lot on China, and then all of a sudden I realized that the professor and also the whole system was gathering information on us, and they were making lists, etc. Of course, I was at the time I think it was the first Trump administration, so they shut that down. I wasn't aware of how bad it was, and so of course it was really my first interaction with something of this sort. But then of course as I do more research and talk to people, these Chinese e-vehicles, a lot of Chinese electronics, for example, in Israel itself, but also I suspect also in the United States, they found that electric vehicles coming from China do gather information and track people who use them, to the point where the Israeli Defense Ministry had to ban its own members and colonels from using them. And I suspect that they do the same thing in the United States, and they do it through TikTok, they do it through other things. Someone mentioned to me, I don't know if it's true, but I'm not surprised if it is, that TikTok in China is very different from TikTok in the United States. TikTok in China is really about, exposing kids to very things they can learn, documentaries, really things that show how China is beautiful, etc. But in the United States, it's really about anything that goes against it, and I thought it's a very important contrast. So So I'm very supportive of any way of really monitoring these applications, because they do the same thing for U.S. applications and they do the same thing for U.S. companies. I don't think that the United States should just sit there and wait for the Chinese to make the rules for them. I think it's only fair. Of course, it's it's a lot of information warfare and cyber warfare going on from the Chinese side. Of course, the Iranians also use this platform, the Russians as well. The Russians, their messaging is I think they fund a little bit both sides, on the left and on the right, because on the extreme left they're also pro Russia, on the extreme right they also are, and so they there was this scandal a few months ago on how a lot of podcasters were paid by the Russians, and they had no idea about it. But that's how they function, and I think yes, it's really time to take it very seriously.
Wow, these are very frightening concepts that we're listening to you to and hearing from you. Um, so all of these actors, China, Russia, Iran, they're active in different places, but their goals seem to be aligned to just weaken the West, empower extremism, reshape the global order. Um, do you feel we're witnessing a coordinated multi-front campaign against the West and its values?
Against the West and its values, I think for sure. I mean, the for example, this is something when I learned I was really flabbergasted. But in Europe, Europe is really known for its industrial genius, and how, especially in Germany, they're really proud about the manufacturing, the industry, etc. But you can see recently how all of that has faded away. Why? Because the Russians have been, for example, funding a lot of these green, anti-pollution NGOs, and they went after a lot of manufacturers and industries. And so it's very subversive because it's about protecting the environment, but it's really about dismantling Germany's and also the Europe's economy. And so they go, and so this is how I think they do it in a very subversive and clever way. Of course they make sure that, because they're really the core of a strong military is also having a strong economy. That's the way you finance it. And so of course when you dismantle the economy, you also dismantle the way you can really construct a good military. And this is something that Europe has been struggling with. On Iran, the Iranians have been pushing for so much propaganda on the Palestine question, on anything regarding the Middle East. The Israelis are seen as the ones who destabilize the Middle East when the Iranians have a proxies in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. They are destabilizing every single neighbor they have. I mean, even the Pakistanis, I think, were upset from it, and they had to go against the Iranians. And of course, this is something they try to shape the perception to and weaponize it. And I think this is how, I think they go against the West on multiple ways.
Very, very frightening to hear all this. And hopefully, our administration understands this and is working towards, towards maybe fighting against this awful current. Zineb, thank you so much for bringing clarity to such a complex and urgent moment in global affairs. From Africa to the Middle East, Ukraine to right here at home, it's clear that these are not isolated events. They're connected, coordinated, and consequential. And your insights help us to see the bigger picture. And for our listeners, that's really critical. It's critical to be able to open our eyes and see what's really happening and understand what's truly at stake for Israel, the United States, and for the free world. So thank you so much for coming on and going through that.
Thank you very much, Trudy. It's a real pleasure to speak with you.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us. This has been Nothing But the Truth with Trudy Stern. You can catch us every Thursday at 9:30 p.m. on the radio. And if you missed any part of the show or want to listen to any of our past episodes, you can find Nothing But the Truth wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, stay strong, stay informed, and keep seeking nothing but the truth.